All right, buckle up, because today we're going deep on something pretty huge. Donald Trump's interview on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, over 3 hours of Trump unfiltered.
It's a lot, right? So instead of hitting you with the whole thing, we're focusing on the most surprising stuff. Things even people who follow Trump closely might have missed.
Ready to go beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. Let's start with pre-politics Trump. You might not know this, but he had a really positive media image back then.
He was on shows like The View, even Oprah.
Whoa, seriously? That's hard to picture now.
He was this charismatic businessman, a pop culture figure.
Wild. But he talks about how that changed when he started doing well in the polls.
He was at the top of his game with The Apprentice. NBC was begging him to stay.
But those poll numbers, they seem to spark something in him, a political ambition.
So he walks away from reality TV for a shot at the White House. Pretty big jump.
Huge. And he describes his first time in the White House. He was in awe, called it a hallowed place.
But that feeling, it didn't last long. He was hit with political attacks almost immediately.
Impeachment threats right out of the gate. What a welcome to Washington.
He says that the pressure, it never let up.
Ugh.
Fighting political battles while trying to run the country.
And remember, he had zero political experience going in.
The ultimate outsider, that made appointing people to key roles really tough.
Because he didn't have those insider connections.
He was relying on recommendations, vetting people on the fly. Can you imagine? Building a cabinet while under constant attack.
Okay, another thing that stood out to me was their discussion of Trump's communication style. You know, how he skips the political jargon and just says what he thinks.
It's interesting. Even Rogan, who's not a Trump supporter, admits he likes that directness,
They both agreed that the media, even when they were criticizing him, they ended up spreading his message.
amplifying it, which
Yeah.
helped his popularity.
Rogan even brings up that you'd be in jail line to Hillary Clinton. Remembers how it cut through all the noise. Pure Trump.
It's like he broke the rules of politics, said what others wouldn't, and that really connected with some people.
It definitely shook things up. Now let's talk policy. Some of his positions, they're exactly what you'd expect, like his support for law enforcement.
Yeah, he's super critical of defund the police,
Yeah.
says it hurt morale and led to more crime.
And he uses personal stories to back it up.
He talks about a time he asked why the government was paying for gender reassignment surgeries for detainees while police departments were struggling to get funding.
Controversial, sure. But it shows how he prioritizes law enforcement and what he sees as responsible spending.
Speaking of controversial, we got to talk tariffs.
He calls them more beautiful than love because he believes they helped the U.S. economy.
For anyone who doesn't know, tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods.
He says they protect American businesses and workers, even if it means some things get more expensive.
It's a classic protectionist argument.
But here's the thing. While he loves tariffs, he also talks about how much he admires Elon Musk and SpaceX.
Especially the creation of Space Force and the role of Starlink in emergencies, like Ukraine.
He sees that technology as crucial for America's future.
It's a more nuanced view than people might expect. He's not anti-progress, he's just very particular about what kind of progress he supports.
Exactly. And that brings us to environmental regulations. He often sees them as getting in the way of economic growth.
He criticizes the process for getting construction permits,
Yeah.
talks about all the red tape.
He says environmental consultants take advantage of the system. This comes from his experience as a developer, building things.
He sees a lot of these regulations as pointless and burdensome.
Making things more expensive for no good reason.
And this is a big part of why some people are drawn to him. They feel overregulated, like the government is always in their business.
Okay, ready for a topic you might not expect? California.
Trump spends a lot of time on California's problems,
Yeah.
and he doesn't hold back.
He's especially harsh on San Francisco's homelessness crisis. Talks about the city being overrun with human waste.
Even mentions apps that track where it is. It's pretty graphic.
He blames liberal policies for what he sees as a decline in the city.
And then there's water. He claims California is rationing water when there's no drought.
He says they're favoring fish over farms and homes. It's a very different picture of California than what many people have.
It shows that he's not just focused on national issues. He sees California as an example of what he believes are failed liberal policies.
Oh, okay, get this. On energy, he actually supports nuclear power.
Yeah, the modern kind. Calls it safe and efficient.
A lot of people might not associate him with nuclear power.
He thinks it's a practical solution, but then he turns around and slams wind energy.
Windmills specifically. He brings up bird deaths, the noise, the visual impact.
He calls abandoned wind farms graveyards. Strong imagery.
Again, his views on the environment aren't so simple. He picks and chooses what he supports.
It's part of his populist appeal. He's willing to go against the grain, even if it means supporting something like nuclear power, which a lot of conservatives traditionally oppose.
Now, we can't avoid this. Election integrity and media bias.
He really leans into his claims of election interference, and he ties that to media bias.
He says the media is part of the problem, distorting the truth and undermining democracy.
He's deeply skeptical of polls, says they can be rigged to influence people.
He brings up his own rallies, how they were packed, even when polls showed him losing.
He also questions voting machines, says he prefers paper ballots.
Like Elon Musk, actually.
He's not just complaining, he's offering what he sees as solutions to make elections more secure.
Okay, before we go to part 2, let's recap.
We started with pre-politics Trump, the businessman with a good media image.
Then we talked about his jump into politics, the impeachment threats, the challenges of being an outsider.
We covered his communication style, his admiration for Elon Musk, and his views on everything from law enforcement to tariffs to the environment.
And we touched on his deep distrust of institutions, the media, the election process.
We've just scratched the surface. Stick with us for part 2. We'll get into even more surprising stuff. You won't want to miss it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Donald Trump's talk with Joe Rogan.
We're picking up where we left off, exploring some of the less expected stuff. And there's a lot, believe me. Like, did you know Trump has some thoughts on how safe UFC is compared to boxing?
Really? He prefers one over the other. That's not what I would have guessed.
He actually brings up something Rogan knows a lot about. As a UFC commentator,
Okay.
UFC fighters, they tend to have fewer deaths than boxers.
Interesting. Why does he think that is?
He says it's because of the different ways they fight. In UFC, there's less of that constant head trauma you see in boxing.
Right, because in UFC you can win in different ways. Knockout, submission, points. It's not just about hitting someone in the head over and over.
Exactly. He even compares it to, like, a football player getting knocked out versus a boxer taking repeated blows over a whole fight.
Saying the recovery, the long-term impact, it's just different.
Yeah, and he goes back to his point about how different approaches have different risks and rewards.
And now sometimes what seems more brutal can actually be safer.
Right. Okay, remember we talked about his skepticism of polls?
Yeah.
Well, he also goes into his worries about voting machines. He's on the same page as Elon Musk, actually, about paper ballots being more secure.
So he's not just complaining, he's suggesting solutions.
Exactly. He talks about how complicated voting machines are, the potential for delays. Paper ballots, he sees them as simpler, faster.
And less open to manipulation, in his view.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear him talking about election integrity like that, getting into the details.
Not just making vague claims.
Right, and it all ties into this bigger thing for him, this lack of transparency he sees in government. He brings it up a few times.
Like when he talks about the JFK files.
Exactly. He reminds everyone that he held back some of those files.
For national security reasons.
Right. But then he promises to release the rest if he's reelected.
It's a pretty savvy move. People are fascinated by those files.
And it lets him look like the champion of transparency.
Especially after all the controversies of his own administration.
Yeah, exactly. He's framing it as, like, a public service, shedding light on the past.
Speaking of shedding light, we have to talk about UFOs.
Oh, yeah? He went there.
He did.
He talks about meeting with pilots who've seen things they can't explain.
So he's not saying he believes, but he's not dismissing it either.
He even mentions how his administration declassified some UFO information.
Okay.
And promises more transparency if he's elected.
Again, with the transparency, it's a smart way to connect with people who are curious about UFOs.
Especially younger voters.
Who might not care as much about the usual political stuff.
Right. He's finding ways to connect with people outside that bubble. And that brings us to something else unexpected. His potential team up with RFK Jr. on national health.
Wait, what? This is where it gets really interesting.
Two guys from totally different sides of the political spectrum finding common ground on health.
What's interesting is it's not just about healthcare policy, right?
Right. It's about a bigger idea of well-being.
Rogan gets in on this too, and they're all talking about things like diet, exercise, avoiding harmful chemicals.
It's almost a holistic view, which you don't hear a lot from politicians.
And they tie it to the economy.
Yeah, the idea that a healthier population would need less medication, be more productive.
Stronger as a nation. It's a surprisingly positive message from Trump.
Especially since he's often so negative about the state of the country.
It shows he still believes in positive change.
And he's open to working with unusual allies to make it happen.
Okay, so we've got UFOs, election integrity, health, and fitness.
Oh, and they also got into illegal immigration and human trafficking.
Right, I was wondering about those.
Trump's still hardline on border security,
Not surprising.
but he frames it as protecting American workers and communities.
Tapping into those anxieties.
Exactly. And did he talk about transgender athletes?
I was wondering if that would come up.
Yep. He reiterated his opposition to transgender women competing in women's sports.
Saying it's unfair.
Undermines women's athletics, he says.
Again, aligning with those who feel traditional values are threatened.
And of course, we can't ignore his claims about the 2020 election.
Figured that would come up.
He spends a lot of time repeating his belief that it was stolen.
Didn't back down at all.
Not one bit. He doubles down, talking about irregularities, judges being afraid to challenge the results.
Does he offer any proof?
He mentions books and articles that back him up, but he doesn't give any concrete evidence during the interview.
That's concerning. It undermines trust in our system.
Especially since so many people believe him.
It's a troubling part of his rhetoric. But what about the future? Did he talk about what a second term would look like?
He mentions some priorities, but in broad terms, like foreign policy. He talks about being strong on the world stage, securing the border, boosting the economy.
Sounds familiar.
And he emphasizes law and order, cracking down on crime, supporting law enforcement.
The law and order president.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He criticizes the current administration's policies.
Saying they've weakened America.
Right. So it's a mix of his usual themes and some new twists, all built around this idea that America is failing and only he can save it.
A message that resonates with a certain segment of the population.
Those who are unhappy with how things are and want to go back to what they see as a better time.
But it's also a message based on fear and division.
Which could lead to more polarization and conflict in society.
It highlights the challenges America faces and how divided we are.
Okay, so we've covered foreign policy, election integrity, UFOs, even health and fitness.
It's been quite a ride.
And there's still more to come. In the final part, we'll dig into Trump's most controversial claims, his thoughts on America's future, and what he sees for a second term. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Donald Trump's interview on Joe Rogan.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From the surprising
To the controversial.
And now we're getting into what really defines Trump, right?
Yeah.
That confidence.
That no-holds-barred style.
He challenges everyone and everything.
It's in these moments, I think, that we see what makes him tick.
What drives him?
His vision for America.
One thing that kept coming up for me was his criticism of the media.
Well, yeah, it's a big theme for him.
But it's more than just calling them fake news.
Right.
He gives specific examples of what he sees as bias, unfair treatment, deliberate attempts to undermine his presidency.
He feels like he was constantly under attack.
He talks about times he felt misrepresented,
Taken out of context.
targeted with negative coverage, even when he was doing good things.
He brings up an example with Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Says they edited out a part where she messed up a response.
Trying to make her look better.
And what's interesting is Rogan agrees with him on this.
Really?
They both worry about how much power the media has
To shape what people think.
to control the narrative.
It's part of a bigger distrust of the media.
That's growing everywhere, not just on the right.
And that distrust extends to the political system itself.
Yeah.
Trump repeats his claim that the 2020 election was stolen.
Even though there have been recounts, court rulings,
He's not letting go of that.
he points to problems with mail-in ballots.
Says judges were too scared to challenge the results.
He even mentions books and articles that support his view.
Trying to show he's not just making things up.
But he doesn't offer any hard proof during the interview,
It's a pattern of allegations without solid evidence.
which raises some serious questions
About our democracy.
about trust in elections.
Especially with so many people believing him.
It's a dangerous path.
But okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about his vision for the future? If he were to be reelected, what does he say he'd do?
He lays out some priorities, but in broad terms.
Like what?
Restoring America's strength in the world,
Uh-huh.
securing the border,
Okay.
reviving the economy,
The usual stuff.
and he's big on law and order,
Hmm.
cracking down on crime, backing the police.
The law and order president, like we talked about.
Exactly. He's very critical of the current administration,
Saying they've made America weaker.
at home and abroad,
So it's a mix of his usual themes and some new ideas.
all centered around this idea that America is in decline.
And only he can fix it.
It's a message that appeals to a certain group of people.
Those who feel left behind, who miss the way things used to be.
But it's also a message based on fear and division.
Which worries me. It could make things even more polarized.
It's a stark reminder of the challenges we face as a country.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Trump's conversation with Joe Rogan, One thing is clear. He's a complicated guy.
He knows how to promote himself, how to connect with people,
He's not afraid to speak his mind no matter what.
whether you love him, hate him, or somewhere in between.
He's a force to be reckoned with.
This deep dive, I think it gave us a glimpse into how he sees the world,
What motivates him?
his vision for America.
It's a reminder that to really understand someone, even someone you disagree with,
You have to listen.
think critically.
Be open to ideas that challenge you.
If you want simple answers.
You won't find them here.
But if you're willing to engage with the complexities of our political reality,
This conversation offers some valuable insights.
into the mind of one of the most influential and controversial figures of our time.
We encourage you to check out the full Joe Rogan Experience episode to hear it all for yourself.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.